To Fall for Mr. Darcy. A Pride and Prejudice variation. Written by Renata McMann and Summer Hanford. Narrated by Benjamin Fife. Chapter 1. George Wickham lounged in a chair in the little parlour in the Darcys' rented house in Ramsgate, about to go mad with boredom. Georgiana sat at the pianoforte, brow wrinkled in concentration, as she played the long, difficult piece he'd selected, the sort of lofty twaddle enjoyed by the accomplished set. It would be endearing how hard she worked to perform it properly for him, if he didn't have to endure listening to it. The pianoforte had been moved and reoriented at Wickham's insistence, ostensibly so that morning light would fall on the pages for Georgiana to better read them. This left it woefully out of tune, which mattered not at all. The difference between discordant sounds and boring music meant little. The tuning of a pianoforte was, in Wickham's mind, an unnecessary expense, but Mrs. Young had it tuned anyway, citing Georgiana's worry that her performance wouldn't please him. The only pleasing thing about her performance was that he didn't need to do anything except appear to be enjoying her music. She reached a particularly tricky section and redoubled her efforts, haunching over the keys in a way that emphasized her gangly form. Heaven help him, once they were married he'd ensure she never played for him again, not wishing to see or hear her do so. In fact, he wouldn't even permit an instrument in their home. A pianoforte was an absurd waste of funds, better used for actual entertainment. While Georgiana concentrated, her governess, Mrs. Young, rose. She gave Wickham a nod and slipped from the room, her ability to do so unobserved by her ward, the real reason for his insistence on moving the instrument. Stealthy as a cat, she disappeared down the hall to pry in Georgiana's room. Mrs. Young returned to the parlour a short time later, entering as quietly as she'd left. She retook her place and picked up her knitting, appearing for all the world as if she hadn't left. Once she'd ordered herself, she turned to him, a look he met with raised eyebrows. With a slight smile, Mrs. Young gave a tiny shake of her head. Good. That meant Georgiana hadn't mentioned his presence in Ramsgate to her brother. Nor had she since Wickham's arrival some weeks ago. Her omission indicated that she had some inkling that he and Darcy had fallen out. Her tacit compliance in keeping his presence a secret suggested his suit was working. Soon she would be ready to elope with him. Wickham settled back, pleased with the progress of his plan and with his fellow conspirator. Mrs. Young was proving worth every penny of the £100 advance he'd given her to help him implement his plan. And when she never saw the 900 he'd promised after that plan came to fruition, well, that was on her for believing him. He suppressed a chuckle at the recollection of how she'd had him pen and sign the offer, as if a scrap of paper could actually force him to turn over £900. Really, to whom did she think she could take such a letter and hope for justice? Wickham studied the plaster ceiling, daydreamed about what he could buy with Georgiana's dowry, and tried to ignore the ongoing playing. Askance, he noted that Mrs. Young knitted quite fast. Did she think Georgiana observant enough to notice if she hadn't produced a certain quantity? He highly doubted she was. Finally, to his relief, Georgiana's hands stilled. She sat taller and swivelled on the bench to look at him, expression eager. "That was beautiful," he said. "As are you." Georgiana smiled, preening under his praise, another sign of his ongoing success with her. When he'd arrived, even the slightest compliment had rendered her face an ugly red and made her study the floor. Now she sought the affirmation he provided, which made her marginally more attractive, at least. Mrs. Young ceased her stitching to smile at Georgiana. "Have you any further thoughts you wish to put in your letter to your brother?" Georgiana swivelled all the way around on the bench, to see behind her on the other side. She shook her head, making her middling brown curls dance. Any intelligent young woman would brighten them to blonde, but Georgiana didn't. "No, I already made mention of the Milfords." She smirked. "Do you know, I believe their son has become engaged to Mary." She darted a look at Wickham as she spoke. Mrs. Young chuckled in what Wickham read as feigned amusement, which experience told him Georgiana wouldn't see through, and said, "That is for the best. You wouldn't want your brother to worry you've grown attached to young Mr. Milford." The Milfords were a fictional family, supposedly introduced to Georgiana by a distant connection of Darcy's. In concern that his sister wasn't socializing enough, Darcy had written to Mrs. Young suggesting that Georgiana go out more. As Georgiana mingling in society directly hindered Wickham's plan to seduce her, Mrs. Young had playfully invented the Milfords, and convinced Georgiana that the harmless deception of writing to her brother about them would give him solace, and permit her to do as she pleased. The duplicity played into Wickham's hands well, encouraging Georgiana to see herself as a young woman ready to make her own decisions, and Darcy as an overprotective older brother. Georgiana nodded. "I thought so too. I feared that after I wrote that I was stranded there overnight when that last storm came through, he might begin to worry." She rolled her eyes. "He does so worry, as if I'm a child." "Which you are certainly not," Mrs. Young agreed. "But you are a young woman who'd best sign and seal her letter. I'm sending a footman over with the post soon." Georgiana stood and smoothed her skirts. She turned to give Wickham another smile. At least her teeth were good. "I won't be long." As soon as Georgiana's footfalls faded down the hall, her clomping tread nowhere near as light as Mrs. Young's delicate steps, Wickham said, "Dance lessons in town today?" "Yes, an important lesson, during which I will take tea on the corner." The usual time and place of their meetings, then, but Wickham frowned. Why had she added important? Had something come up to jeopardize their plan? He gave her a searching look, but she shook her head. He tipped his to the side and heard it too. Footfalls in the hall as one of the servants passed. Moments later, before he deemed speech safe once more, Georgiana returned, steps quick in her hurry to be with him. Wickham endured the remainder of the morning in Georgiana's presence, then took his leave, feigning regret that her dance lesson would keep them apart. He vowed that, to balance out those excruciating hours of pretending to be enamoured with a brat of 15, he would make a late night of it. That plan in mind, he returned to his rented room for a nap, to pass the time until he must meet Mrs. Young in the tea-shop. He woke a bit later than he'd hoped, and went to find his fellow conspirator. Entering the shop, Wickham waved off the proprietor as he made his way to come over, and went to the back. He dropped into the seat opposite Mrs. Young, hoping she was worrying about nothing. She took a sip of tea. "Do you want to order anything?" How like her. She wanted him to spend money on something that wasn't worth it, simply to please someone who didn't matter. "Are you buying?" She could afford it, after all. He'd given her £100. She sighed, waved the proprietor over, and ordered coffee for Wickham. It pleased him that she remembered he preferred coffee to tea. They waited in silence until the coffee was brought. Once the shopkeeper retreated again, Mrs. Young lowered her voice and said, "We have a problem. Mr. Darcy wrote to me to make certain that Miss Darcy will be available the day after tomorrow. He wishes to surprise her with a visit." "So tell him she will not be available."
I already wrote back to him expressing as much, and claiming an engagement with the Milfords, but it seems he has somewhat pressing business with a holding in Scotland, and this is his only opportunity for some time to visit his sister. He insists she be available."
Wickham cursed. Precisely like Darcy to change his words from request to command when the request failed. He liked to appear amiable, but wouldn't let appearance interfere with his will being carried out. "Too many people have seen me. Even if Georgiana can last a whole day without mention of me, someone else may." Darcy would never condescend to speak with the cottage's staff, but his valet, Stevens, would, as would any other servants he dragged along. "And what if he asks to meet the Milfords?" A scowl pulled down Wickham's mouth. "Foolish idea, that, on your part."
"You've made no complaint before now. The Milfords have been very helpful in keeping him away. They've admirably filled her schedule."
"That they have, but you should have arranged some way for them to be more difficult for her to beg off from."
"Such as?"
Mrs. Young asked tartly. He opened his mouth to reply that figuring out a reasonable such as was her concern, not his, but closed it again as the proprietor returned to ask if they required anything further.
"You could ask her tomorrow,"
Mrs. Young said once the man departed with their assurance that they required nothing more. Wickham shook his head. "It's too soon. She won't agree to elope with me yet. I need more time."
"We don't have more time. Mr. Darcy will be here the day after tomorrow. He's already in Kent."
"Is he?" An idea sparked in Wickham. They'd travelled in Kent together as boys, visited Darcy's aunt, and then gone on to Ramsgate, but with one all-important delay. An ill coachman had combined with a broken wheel to keep them betwixt the two destinations for days. While Darcy the senior had dealt with that, a young Wickham and Darcy had explored the region quite thoroughly. "At Rosings Park?"
"Yes."
Mrs. Young's expression became speculative.
"Why?"
"I can delay him." Wickham reached to pour more coffee. Confidence restored. "I know the route he'll take." Or rather, he had an idea of how to ensure that Darcy went the way he wished. Would Darcy remember their trek off the two main roadways between Rosings and the coast? The winding dirt road, wide enough for only one carriage, a sheer drop to a river running along one side, and a steep slope upward along the other. The bridge over the ravine, water glinting far below, where they'd played at being highwaymen. Wickham nodded to himself. Darcy would remember. He never forgot or forgave anything. Mrs. Young studied Wickham with raised eyebrows.
"How can you be certain? There are two main roadways between here and there, and who knows how many smaller ones."
"You forget how well I know Darcy." And Wickham had barely enough time to make certain that Darcy couldn't go either of the well-travelled ways. Mrs. Young shook her head.
"Assuming you truly do know him well enough to predict the route he'll take, you will delay him how? By chopping down a tree to fall across the road? Mr. Darcy has the resources to easily overcome any such obstacle. A few hours' delay won't be enough."
"If I fail, a few hours is all we'll have, so you'd better make it enough."
"I'll do my best to have her ready," Mrs. Young said dubiously, "but the longer the delay, the greater our chance of success."
Wickham hoisted his coffee, grinning over the rim of the cup. "Don't worry. If all goes well, he'll be delayed for days." In fact, if Wickham had his way, Darcy would take ages to reach Ramsgate, if he ever made it at all. Chapter 2. Elizabeth's Uncle Gardner returned to the inn a bit grim-faced, and retook his place at the table she shared with her Aunt Gardner in the somewhat crowded common room. "It's as rumoured," he announced. "Both bridges are out. though there's strong hope the least damaged will be traversable by tomorrow."
"Both?" Aunt Gardner frowned. "How is that possible?"
Uncle Gardner reached for a roll. "Like as not, some sort of Luddite nonsense spilled out across the country."
"Edward,"
Aunt Gardner said, tone full of reprimand, and cast Elizabeth a look askance. Elizabeth tried not to smile.
"Never fear, Aunt. Papa lets me read the papers. I know all about Luddites." "Still, it's not a fit subject for conversation," Aunt Gardner said with a continued frown at her husband. "Not for young women or common rooms. Whoever did it, they'll have cause to hide," Uncle Gardner continued as he reached for the butter. "When the Northern Bridge went down, it took a team and wagon with it. Team and driver died." "Edward," Aunt Gardner gasped. "Honestly, consider who you're with."
Uncle Gardner shrugged and slathered butter on the roll. "So, as we must perforce spend at least one more day here, how will we carry on?"
"Can we not take another road?"
Elizabeth asked, for the village was quite small, and they'd thoroughly explored it the previous afternoon when they arrived. Uncle Gardner lowered the roll he was about to bite to say, "There are local roadways, but the nearest is reputed to be hardly wide enough for one carriage, let alone passing. And along a steep ravine at that. If one bridge wasn't expected to be working by tomorrow, I would chance it, but as it is, the risk of having to back half a mile down a winding roadway along a ravine seems hardly worth a day's travel." He bit into his roll. Aunt Gardner nodded. "We can take a turn about the village." The village, a term Elizabeth felt too liberally applied, consisted of the posting inn, in which they stayed, 2 shops, and a small cluster of homes. They'd walked the length of the single street 4 times the afternoon before. Fortunately, Elizabeth had spotted a winding trek into the forest as they'd gamboled.
"Might we explore the forest road?"
she asked, hopeful yet doubting her aunt would wish to. Aunt Gardner, not one for much walking, shook her head but smiled.
"You may if you can scrounge up a chaperone. I will be content with town. The innkeeper has a daughter. Perhaps once the morning crowd thins, she'll agree to accompany me."
Elizabeth's supposition proved true, and after being extolled by the innkeeper to return his daughter Lucy in time to help with luncheon, the girl was permitted to accompany Elizabeth. Leaving the inn, Elizabeth set a quick pace through town, pleased that Lucy didn't seem to have trouble keeping up. In short order they crossed from the bright sunlight of a summer morning into the cool shadows of the forest, and Elizabeth took a deep breath, the air already less hot and dust-choked.
"Do you always help with breakfast and luncheon?"
she asked to make conversation as they strode deeper into the woods.
"Since I was 6. How old are you now?" 11, miss."
Elizabeth cast Lucy a quick look, decided she was tall for her age, and wondered if she'd been tall at 6 too. That seemed to delve too far beyond light conversation, so rather than pursue it, she asked,
"Where does this roadway go?" "Over the ravine, miss."
So this was the nearby route that her uncle deemed too precarious to attempt. "Is it safe to walk here?" Lucy cast her a surprised look.
"Oh, aye, miss."
She brought up both hands, palms held near together.
"It gets narrow is all, for a cart and horses along the ravine."
Reassured, Elizabeth walked on. A short time later, a tromp and a creak alerted her, and she turned to see a buggy and one coming up from behind. She and Lucy moved off to the side among the trees' gnarled roots, and the buggy clattered by, the driver offering a passing nod of greeting. Elizabeth imagined it would take skilled handling to get anything much wider down the road. A short time later, the trees to their left thinned, then disappeared altogether to reveal clear sky as a ravine cut through the forest. To their right, the slope grew ever steeper. Elizabeth soon realized she wouldn't wish to have a buggy pass now, let alone a carriage. Should one, she and Lucy would need to either climb the slope into the trees or swim, and the gurgling little river at the bottom of the ravine was a long way down.
"Are we nearly to the bridge?"
Elizabeth asked. She'd like to see it before they turned back, but not if that meant too much longer on this road. Lucy raised her hand in a squiggling gesture.
"Yes, 2 more bends."
Lucy seemed unconcerned, and Elizabeth imagined there was little traffic on the road, and that the girl wouldn't mind clambering into the tree trunks on the steep hillside. Elizabeth had a touch more dignity, however, or possibly just more care for her boots and gown. Dust and mud she could endure, but if she tore her skirt, she'd be forced to do mending, an activity she'd prefer to avoid. Not that there would be much else to do in the little town come evening. Resolved to see the bridge even at the expense of her hem, she decided they should continue. The view up and down the gully would be lovely from the bridge, she'd no doubt. Worth any incidental sewing. They rounded the next curve, then the following, and the bridge came into view, spanning the ravine farther up the roadway. Elizabeth lengthened her stride eagerly, then sighted a man and halted. She caught Lucy's arm, stopping the girl as well. He stood among the trees to the right, broad shoulders to them as he faced the bridge. He had an old floppy hat like a farmer might wear when the sun was too bright, but it was cloudy, and a scarf hung about his neck. One of his arms wrapped about a low limb to keep him on the ravine wall. The other he held low to his side, and in it a pistol. One didn't hunt with a pistol. Elizabeth let out a gasp, the hand that held Lucy's arm squeezing. Very quietly she said, "That man is armed." Lucy gave her a wide-eyed look.
"We should go, miss,"
she whispered. Elizabeth squeezed her lips tight, thinking. They should go, that was clear. Lucy was a chaperone to Elizabeth's virtue, not a guard against armed men. Yet he obviously waited for someone to cross the bridge. His position, likely selected with care, made him all but invisible from the far side of the ravine, and allotted him a stout trunk to duck behind, should anyone come from the village. Were Lucy and Elizabeth any less light of tread, he may well have heard them and taken cover. With that thought, Elizabeth backed them up around the previous bend, then released Lucy's arm and turned to her.
"He's waiting for someone." "We don't have anything to do with that, miss."
Elizabeth nodded. They certainly didn't. But the man had a pistol. He meant to shoot someone.
"Maybe if I shout, I can alert whomever it is before he can,"
she murmured, mostly to herself.
"You can't shout."
Fear filled Lucy's eyes.
"He could shoot you."
She swallowed. Elizabeth could read Lucy's next thought in the girl's eyes. He might shoot me. Lucy edged away from her, angling back down the roadway in the direction of the town.
"Oh, I have to get back. I need to help with luncheon." "Lucy,"
Elizabeth hissed, reading flight in the girl's eyes. Lucy shook her head, turned, and ran. Elizabeth stared after her disappearing form, irresolute. She'd no way to know who the man meant to shoot. It could be someone terrible. After all, what sort of person would someone want to shoot? A person who couldn't possibly be any worse than a man waiting to do the shooting, which meant they might be better. She turned to look up the roadway, then back down in the direction Lucy had run, already out of sight on the twisting lane. Hands balled at her sides, Elizabeth racked mind and heart, trying to decide what to do. Finally, she turned and marched back to the bend that hid the bridge from view. She peeked around the curve to see the man still waited, pistol in hand. Elizabeth set to studying the remainder of the scene, in case more men hid ahead. She saw none, but realized the posts that held up the rails that lined each side of the bridge appeared askew. In fact, they were sawn nearly through. That settled things. Tampering with the bridge put more people than the one he awaited in danger, and may even speak to a larger plan involving the other sabotaged bridges, which would make him a murderer already. If there was anything Elizabeth could do to thwart him, she was duty-bound to try. Should she go back and seek help? She had no way to know when the man might act. Perhaps long before she returned to the village and managed to summon anyone. Did his presence mean his prey drew nigh? How early did one arrive for an ambush? She wished Lucy hadn't fled. Elizabeth would have sent the girl back to seek help. Now, she had no way to know if Lucy would tell anyone about the waiting gunman. Elizabeth's best course must be the assumption that the masked man's victim could arrive at any moment, and that no help would come. Were anyone to be saved, she must do the saving. She drew in a fortifying breath, and then, keeping to the right along the steep upward slope, darted around the curve and behind the nearest tree. She stuck her head out to find the man still faced away from her, watching the bridge. Mustering her courage, and hoping that Lucy would send help, she ran to the next tree, then the next. As carefully and quietly as she could, she worked her way closer. Each time she left the shelter of a tree trunk, she prayed that the man with the gun wouldn't turn around. Chapter 3. Upon learning that both major bridges were out, one incident resulting in a fatality, Darcy made discreet inquiries, discovered the landholder of the area was rather impoverished, and took the liberty of settling a small sum on the dead man's widow, for her and their children. He then went to find his driver, Daniels, who was in the process of unhitching the carriage with the assistance of Darcy's tiger, a lad of 12 or so years. "We'll still be leaving," Darcy informed them. "But the one bridge will be out for weeks, and the other won't be repaired until tomorrow," Daniels protested, then grimaced. "Nasty bit of business all round, I say." Darcy nodded. One bridge giving out, and dropping a wagon driver and his team to their deaths, wouldn't have been suspicious on its own, but coupled with the removal of the planks that formed the roadway of the other bridge, what would have been seen as a horrific accident smacked of murder. A tragic business indeed, but no concern of ours, Darcy noted. The only tie he had to the area was that it happened to stand between his aunt's estate in Western Kent and the house he rented for Georgiana in Ramsgate, and not one that will slow us overly. I know of a third route. "To Ramsgate from here?" Daniels asked. "Hardly to or from anywhere else, as here was where they were, and Ramsgate where they were going. But all Darcy said aloud was, 'Yes, but the roadway is very narrow. I'll ride up top with you to assist. I've a good memory of it.' Darcy supposed his valet, Stevens, might enjoy the unaccustomed solitude of riding alone inside. "You'll get dusty," Daniels protested. Darcy's tiger looked between them with wide eyes, tack draped over his arms. "We'll be going slowly." And a little dust was worth not taking a turn too quickly and ending up at the bottom of a gully. Daniels shrugged his acquiescence and directed the tiger to start re-hitching the team. Later, as they went down a roadway which was wide enough for 2 coaches to pass, but which would become quite narrow after they crossed the bridge that lay ahead, Darcy couldn't help but remember days spent exploring the area with his childhood friend, George Wickham. After a few days of detailed exploration, still delayed in the town ahead, which was small and, to two boys, very boring, they'd come up with the game of French invasion. Pretending the French were coming, they'd scouted the roadway for places from which to ambush them. Darcy's mind ranged back over their boyhood discussion, which they'd taken very seriously. He'd said, "The first thing for us to do would be to take out the bridge, so the French can't bring anything with wheels across the ravine, even if they can climb down and back out on foot. That might buy time to mass English forces." Wickham had nodded, pushed two long blonde hair from his eyes, and said, "Not only take it out with filthy Frenchmen on it." Darcy recalled that he'd thought that through, weighing the morality. He'd finally decided that if the French were invading England, it was acceptable to drop them into a ravine, and rejoined, "If they came with horse-drawn cannons, a shot to scare the horses might make them run right off the bridge." It had seemed unfair to the horses, but French cannons were notoriously destructive. Better French horses than English lives. They were talking about war, after all. Darcy had heard many stories about how much death there was in war. He'd hoped to fight the French himself some day, like his older cousin Richard had planned to do. Wickham had shaken his head. "The rails might keep the horses in. We'd have to weaken them, and best to shoot one. They're horses that go to war. They probably won't be scared unless they feel a ball hit. Then they'd run like mad and end up in the ravine. You'd have to make certain not to shoot the horse dead. Even if there are two, a dead one would make it so the other couldn't run." They'd gone on this way, discussing with great seriousness how they could save good English lives, until they'd grown bored of speculating about the bridge and found a new ambush location. Hidden in the trees on the slope across the bridge, they'd studied passing conveyances and speculated on how to ambush each. Wickham's talk had turned from stopping the French to simple highway robbery and what he could hope to loot. Darcy sighed. He should have known even then what sort of man George Wickham would grow up to be. But he had pleasant memories of their years growing up together regardless. He regretted that his childhood friend had not become someone he wanted to know now that they were grown. And then the bridge over the ravine was before them, and Darcy pulled his thoughts thoroughly into the present, for the way would become treacherous soon. Once they crossed the ravine, they'd enter a stretch of road with a cliff rising to one side and a drop on the other. The roadway ahead snaked along, following the lip of the gully. At least, he thought he'd put his memories from his mind, but there, ahead, jumping free of the bank to stand in the middle of the road on the other side of the bridge, was Wickham. Or rather, a man of Wickham's height, wearing a large hat that partially hid his face, and with a scarf pulled up over the lower half, like a highwayman seeking loot. Darcy stared, stunned, wondering if the man before him was a hallucination, brought on by his memories. But he would hardly hallucinate that Wickham, hat pulled low and scarf pulled up, pointed a pistol at him. No, he wasn't the target, but rather the horses. Suddenly, Darcy knew what Wickham meant to do. He reached over to grab the reins from his driver, who gaped at Wickham with surprise that echoed Darcy's. Darcy hauled on the strips of leather that connected them to the horses, trying to halt his team before they reached the center of the bridge, with only a thin railing between them and the bottom of the gorge. Wickham brought his other hand up to join the first, aiming the pistol. His eyes narrowed. A yowling woman leaped down the slope, arms out, and shoved Wickham. Her momentum took them across the roadway. Wickham braced his feet, sliding to a halt near the lip of the gully. A pistol report rang through the forest. The horses whinnied and tossed their heads, backing up. Wickham unleashed a howl of rage at the woman and shoved her. She tumbled backward over the lip of the gully. Wickham whirled and ran. A second shot sounded, right beside Darcy, making him jump and startling the horses. He bit back a curse, ears ringing, as he fought to control the team before the horses did the work Wickham had clearly meant them to do, and landed his carriage in the ravine. Wickham kept running. Daniels dropped the spent weapon and fumbled under his seat for another. Wickham disappeared around the bend ahead, shielded by the slope. "Don't shoot," Darcy ordered, struggling to gain enough control over the team to back them up, rather than permit them to dart farther onto a bridge he no longer trusted. The moment the horses were calm enough, he pressed the reins on Daniels. "Back them up. Don't cross that bridge. See if you can turn, but first get around the corner, in case he comes back." Darcy jumped down. Framed in the carriage window, he noted his valet's startled face. But he didn't slow. He raced down the slope, only taking enough care not to topple head over heels, readily sighting the still form beside the stream at the bottom. He splashed through the river, fortuitously shallow in summer, and dropped to kneel beside her. She sprawled on her stomach, unmoving. As gently as he could, he turned her over. Mud obscured much of her face. Her eyes didn't open. He lifted her with great care and climbed back up the slope. His carriage was gone now, and he darted a look along the roadway, apprehensive Wickham would return to finish the evil he'd set out to do. Worry prickled along Darcy's spine as he strode up the road, his back to where Wickham had disappeared from sight. Darcy could only hope that Wickham had run, not moved around the bend to reload for a second shot. Stevens came barreling around the corner, Daniel's second pistol in hand. He skidded to a halt when he spotted Darcy and the unconscious woman, then jogged forward to meet them. Darcy's long legs took them away from the bridge and the threat of Wickham. "I'll get inside the carriage with her," Darcy said to Stevens when he reached him. "I want everyone else to be on the lookout. You take the boot seat, with the gun." Stevens nodded. "I'll put the boy up top with Daniels." He let Darcy pass him, then followed, backing around the bend to where the carriage waited. The moment they were out of sight from the bridge, Stevens turned full around and jogged ahead to open the carriage door for Darcy. He stood back, eyes bright with interest, while Darcy lifted the woman in. "Who is she?" Darcy shook his head. "I've no idea." Mud-coated as she was, he felt he should still recognize her if he knew her, which he didn't. By her garb, though, she was a gentlewoman. Her finger bore no ring, but that custom was hardly absolute. "She saved me, though. She pushed Wickham out of the way." "That was George Wickham?" Stevens asked, voice low. Darcy nodded. "He wore a hat and a mask, but I'd know Wickham anywhere." "Fancy him so desperate as to raise a gun to you." Darcy grimaced, well able to imagine Wickham that desperate. He'd become a desperate sort of fellow. "Let's get back to town. If I recall correctly, there's some sort of doctor there." "Not down the road after Wickham?" Stevens looked in that direction now, eyes narrowed in anger. "The next village is very small. They would need to send for the same doctor, and I don't trust that bridge. When we arrive at the inn, there must be someone to alert to the prospective damage done. Find them." "You think Wickham had something to do with the other two bridges as well?" Stevens asked. "I wouldn't put it past him," Darcy said, voice as grim as the idea made him feel. "A man was killed?" "Yes." With that, Darcy climbed in. Stevens closed the door behind him. Darcy listened to the clatter of his valet and tiger clambering into position. Daniels began the arduous task of turning the carriage, and Darcy could only be glad they hadn't crossed the bridge into the narrower section of road. There, the maneuver would have proved impossible. Not that they were likely to have made it over with Wickham tampering with the bridges in the area. Darcy sat beside the woman he'd propped in the corner of the seat, bracing her with one arm so she wouldn't fall as they started moving. Examination showed that blood oozed from a lump on her forehead, and several cuts on her face. Scratches marred her arms. A tear rent her skirt up to her knee, exposing a shapely calf he endeavored to ignore. He longed to use his handkerchief to clean the mud from the stream off her face so he could look upon her visage, but that would be inappropriate. Through the mud she appeared young. She had a slender, pleasing form, an elegantly long neck, thick, dark hair. He prayed she was married. When they reached the town from whence they'd set out that morning, Darcy had no choice but to carry her into the inn, for all to see. She remained unconscious, hardly seeming to breathe, and his worry for her increased. He stood in the entrance hall with the woman in his arms, and people gawking at them, while Stevens arranged a room, despairing to hear the innkeeper inform them that there was but one available, yet aware they were fortunate to have even that. Stevens accepted the key, and Darcy stepped forward to address the innkeeper. "Send for the doctor immediately." The man nodded, face alive with curiosity. He asked, "Who is she, sir? What happened?" He may as well reply now, in front of everyone. Rumour would abound regardless. "We tried the gully road. The bridge stands, though I question if it has been tampered with. A man waited on the far side, masked, and brandishing a pistol. He made to fire, but this woman rushed from the forest and pushed him, sending his shot wide. He then threw her down the gully and fled." That set the crowd to murmuring. Before any more questions could emerge, Darcy started for the staircase that led up to the inn rooms. Stevens hurried to catch up, then passed him once they reached the top of the stairs. He went down the hall to the end and applied the key. Darcy followed, carrying the woman into a much smaller room than the one he'd taken the night before. He placed her atop the bed, the only furnishing aside from a very small table and a wooden stool. "What do we do now, sir?" Stevens asked, as he set the room's key on a small shelf mounted inside the door. "Go down and ask that the doctor be sent up upon his arrival, then see about getting someone out to inspect that bridge. Then get me clean clothes. Should I search for her family?" "I dare say that scene downstairs will bring them if they're in town," Darcy observed wryly. "But, yes, put out word." He glanced again at her muddy face. "We don't have much of a description yet. See if there is a maid who can come up with towels and warm water to clean the mud from her, and a room where I may wash up and change." "Yes, sir. And should I have inquiries made in the next town over, in case she came from there?" "You will have to find someone who can go on foot and climb down into the valley and out again. No one's to ride across the bridge until it's found to be safe." Darcy glanced at the window, surprised how far gone the day was. "If her family isn't in this town, I can't imagine we'll be able to find them before tomorrow." "I agree, sir, but I'll do my best." "Thank you, Stevens. I'll stay here and await the maid." Expression neutral, Stevens nodded and stepped from the room. Darcy stood near the door, waiting for the maid and the doctor, and studied the woman atop the coverlet. Who was she? This stranger who'd risked her life for his? This woman who, were she unmarried and a lady, was now hopelessly compromised as thanks for saving him? This woman he may very well have to marry. He scrubbed his hands over his face, then stopped as he realized mud spattered his palms. Not the day he'd set out to have. What had Wickham been about? Had he truly sabotaged the other bridges to bring Darcy to that long-ago one from their childhood? Why attack Darcy now, with so much at risk if he failed, as he had, and absolutely nothing to gain? No. Wickham had something to gain. He must. He wouldn't do what he had otherwise. The man would hardly get out of bed in the morning if he didn't view the day with hope of some sort of profit. But what? What could he possibly... Georgiana. Darcy was on his way to Georgiana. That must be why. For some reason, some gain to him, Wickham didn't want Darcy to reach his sister. Didn't want him to so much. Wickham had been willing to kill. Darcy pulled out his watch. There was still daylight left. He could ride to the bridge with his tiger, send the horses back, cross on his own, walk to the next town, and nothing, because the town was too small for him to be certain he could secure a mount there, and it would be dark by the time he arrived, rendering the task doubly difficult. Not to mention the woman on the bed. There would be questions and expenses, and words to exchange with her family. He shoved his watch away. He'd give it until tomorrow, one day. No, a morning. He'd remain until noon tomorrow, but then, even if he had to depart and leave her in the care of Stevens, even if not a single bridge were passable, Darcy would resume his journey to Ramsgate post-haste. A maid arrived and began cleaning the woman's face, already discoloured and swelling, providing no real view of her. She had a fine nose and small ears, but beyond that he couldn't be certain. A large bump distorted her forehead. Her lips appeared full, but could simply be swollen. The bottom one was cut, split on a rock, or possibly her own tooth. When the girl lifted a hand to clean it, the woman's whole body jerked. Though she didn't wake, and Darcy realized her left arm twisted at an odd angle, the maid carried on cleaning with more care for the limb. A manservant sent by Stevens arrived with Darcy's clothes and a towel, and permission to wash in the scullery if he made haste. Darcy left the unknown woman with the maid and went down to clean up. He made it back to the room as the maid, dirty towels and basin in hand, departed. The doctor arrived next, turning out to be a surgeon, a fussy young man named Evans. After introducing himself to Darcy, he turned to the woman. "What is her name?" "I don't know." Evans turned a startled look on him. Once again, Darcy offered a quick recounting of the incident at the bridge, leaving out the name Wickham as he had while standing below in the inn's entrance hall. "Saved you, did she?" Mr. Evans said, and turned back to the woman. "Very well. I find using the names of my patients helps them respond better. Since she is unconscious, I suppose it doesn't matter." He examined her injuries, confirming Darcy's suspicion that her left arm was broken, and electing not to bind her head. He did set her arm, and peeled back her eyelids to look into unresponsive eyes. Darcy thought they might be brown. Finally, he stood and turned to Darcy. "I cannot assess the extent of damage done by the blow to her head, nor find all her injuries until she is conscious. I can, however, return in the morning." That suited Darcy's need to leave by midday. "Yes, come first thing in the morning." "If she wakes up, she should be given something to drink. Broth would be best. Try to keep her from choking." "If." "Yes, well, she appears young and fit. She'll probably wake." Mr. Evans began returning his instruments, salves, and wrappings to his medical bag while continuing. "She appears to be unmarried. Judging by her clothing, she isn't poor. If she does recover, you saved her life, but you've also ruined her reputation." He closed his bag and turned to Darcy. Darcy nodded, grim. Evans dipped his head once and left. Darcy studied the woman again, finding little to tell him more about her. Should he ask the maid to return and undress her? Perhaps seek a borrowed nightgown? He didn't feel as if he should give such instructions, but who else could? A husband could. She could be some man's wife and simply not wear a ring. What if she was no man's wife, and he must marry her? An edge of panic crept in as he watched her breathe by the last pink rays of the lowering sun. She might prove vile. He might hate her. Must he truly be bound to this unknown creature? She appeared by her smooth hands and garb to be the daughter of a gentleman, or at least someone of wealth. But were she not, he could offer compensation of a different order. He could give her a generous dowry, which should satisfy both her and her family. If she were a farmer's daughter, which seemed likely with her being in the woods alone, money would make them happy. She may have saved his life, but he would not marry an uneducated nobody. Much depended upon her class and her situation. In a desperate bid to undo what couldn't be undone, Darcy sought the innkeeper, asking, "Have you a female relation who could stay in the room to protect the reputation of the woman I brought in?" The man, serving drinks now in the inn's common room, shook his head. "No, sir. Wife's dead, and we never had any daughters." "What about the maid from earlier? She'll do." Another headshake. "She's gone home. Only comes in to help the cook with the peeling and chopping." Darcy frowned. Had he known, he would have paid her to remain. "Is the cook still here? I require broth, in case the woman wakes." "Aye. I'll ask what can be done, sir." "Thank you." Darcy pivoted and went back to the room. Some time later, a knock sounded. Darcy looked up from the flickering glow of the candle he'd lit. He rose from the hard seat of the stool and went to open the door, startled to find Stevens rather than the innkeeper. Stevens handed him a bowl and spoon. "The proprietor said I may as well bring this up as I was on my way." Leaving the door open, Darcy went to put the broth on the little table. "Any luck?" "I'm afraid not, sir. No one knows her. I sent word to the next town over. They've declared that bridge safe, except for the railings. Should I head over and search more tonight?" And wake people from their beds to ask if they knew a woman he couldn't even accurately describe? No. If you already sent someone, I'm sure they'll get word out. "Is there anything else I can do for you, sir? Should I bring up a meal?" "That would be appreciated. I could also use some blankets and a pillow." Stevens looked past him to the woman on the bed. "We're sleeping in the carriage, sir, if you'd rather join us. The inside seats are comfortable enough to get a good night's sleep." "No, someone should be here if she wakes." Darcy supposed that was his responsibility now, unless he learned something to make it otherwise. "Very well, sir. And, sir, you should know that I asked Daniels if he thought that man was Wickham, and he said he'd no right idea who the man was, 'cause he didn't know Mr. Wickham well." Darcy nodded, absorbing that. Was he certain the man was Wickham? He'd left out any name in his recounting to the innkeeper and Evans. Why? Because he knew he couldn't prove the man with the gun was George Wickham, or because his guess as to the assailant's identity hinged on the memories in which he'd stewed. "Sir?" Darcy shook his head. "I'm certain it was Wickham." He knew George too well not to recognize him in an instant, even with part of his face obscured. But let us keep that between us until we can find proof. Without proof, my certainty means little, and if he has any inkling he was identified, finding proof will be that much harder. Wickham would take any steps he could to thwart them. Stevens nodded. "I'll tell Daniels as much. I'll return shortly with your dinner and the blankets." He did, and, after dismissing him, Darcy lay out a bed as best he could on the hard plank floor, then sat to a meagre dinner. As he ate, he studied the woman once more. her worsening bruises appearing quite dark by the light of the single candle on the little table. She showed no sign of waking. When he finished his meal, he went to the end of the bed and unlaced each boot, not wishing her to sleep in them. With great care he clasped her left calf and raised her foot to tug the boot free. He repeated the process with the other, trying not to note how well turned her ankles were. He placed her footwear, fine enough to belong to the daughter of a gentleman, at the foot of the bed. Finally, he carefully inched the coverlet out from under her so he could drape it over her to keep her warm. Her comfort seen to insomuch as he was able, he settled into his makeshift bed. The floorboards were hard against his back. The bed and stool seemed to loom on either side of him. He felt cold, despite the summer heat. He wished he could at least have darkness to aid his slumber, but he didn't want to blow out the candle in case she woke. He could only imagine how frightened she would be alone in an unknown place in the dark, covered with bruises. With that blow to her head, she may not even remember what had happened to bring her here. Sure, he'd never find sleep on the hard floor. He closed his eyes and settled into slow, deep breaths. Chapter 4. Darcy blinked his eyes open, sleep clouding his mind. He took in the looming bed and stool and realized he lay on a floor. He'd fallen asleep on a floor.
"Hello?"
A sweet female voice said, ragged at the edges and touched with worry.
"Is someone here?"
The day flooded back to him. He sat up.
"Oh!"
the woman gasped, eyes wide.
Hello?"
Definitely brown, he thought, though one of her eyes was partially swollen closed. A warm honey brown by candlelight, and, though wary, holding a commendable lack of panic. With no idea what to say, he mimicked her. "Hello."
"Where am I? What happened?"
She made to raise her broken left arm and winced, looking down to take in the splint. With her other hand she gingerly touched her head. She then glanced about the little room before focusing on him once more.
"And I apologize for my rudeness, but who are you?"
"Do you remember being on the roadway at the bridge?" She nodded, then grimaced and touched her head again.
"Yes, I recognize you. A man was about to shoot you, and I tried to stop him. You and another man were driving a carriage."
It relieved him that she'd suffered no loss to her memory. "You did stop him. At least you kept him from hitting anything important." A frown of thought turned down her bruised lips, and then her good eye went wide.
"He pushed me down the hill," she gasped. "He tried to kill me."
"Yes, he seems to have been bent on murder."
"Who was he?"
"I have a suspicion, but I wouldn't wish to slander anyone without proof."
"So he was at the bridge waiting for you, Mr.—"
She trailed off expectantly. "Mr. Darcy, Fitzwilliam Darcy, of Pemberley." He may as well give his Christian name, as her cultured tones and intelligence were additional evidence that he was going to have to offer for her. She studied him with a lack of recognition. Not that he expected everyone to know his name. In London, important people would know that Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy of Pemberley possessed sought-after wealth, connections, and holdings. But they weren't in London. Sitting on the floor beside a battered woman he didn't know, who was obviously not part of the Tom, Darcy suddenly longed for the opportunity to parley his assets into choosing a wife, an obligation that had only inconvenienced him afore. Now he doubted he'd ever be able to. Fate had chosen for him.
"Well, Mr. Darcy of Pemberley, I would very much like to understand why I'm in what appears to be an inn-room with you. and to ask if whoever doctored my arm realized that some of my ribs may be broken."
"He did not, as you were unconscious, and could not tell him what hurt, but he'll be back come morning."
"He?"
"Mr. Evans." She nodded, and he had the impression of a keen mind filing away the information.
"And why am I here with you, and not with my aunt and uncle?"
Her calm, reasonable attitude steadied him. There could be worse things than a woman with a pleasing figure and a quick mind. A brave woman, he amended. One who did what was right in the moment action was needed. Or a mad woman with no sense of propriety or consequence. With no way to know which, he could only answer plainly, though he preferred to believe he would regardless. "You are here because your injuries seem dire. We couldn't leave you. We couldn't cross the bridge to search for those who know you. Not with Wickham around the corner with a gun and the trusses possibly sabotaged. We had no choice but to bring you here to the local surgeon, and with the bridges out, this is the only room."
"Where is the other man?"
"My coachman, valet, and Tiger are sleeping in the carriage."
"But you were driving."
She thought him a coachman. She'd saved him without even realizing he was a gentleman. No, she wasn't saving the life of one man, but of everyone in the carriage. Riley, he realized that her goal may even have been to save the horses, or his Tiger, a mere boy. He couldn't know her motivation. Darcy blinked in the candlelight, taken aback by his own thought. Should social standing factor into saving a life? His gut said no, and yet would he risk his life to save, say, a murderer about to hang? But that was more an issue of moral standing than societal. Many people thought the two equated.
"So you aren't a coachman?"
the woman prompted. She looked him up and down.
"I suppose not. Your clothes are not the clothes of a coachman."
Darcy shook his head, more to clear it than in answer. It had been a long, stressful day, and he hadn't slept well on the hard floor. "I am not. I was assisting my driver in navigating a difficult roadway, as I'd travelled it before, years ago." She nodded, digesting that information. Absurdly, Darcy hoped it reflected favourably upon him. "May I have your name?" he asked. She made to raise her left arm again, glanced at the bandage, and used her right hand to push thick dark tresses behind her ears. He realized her hair had fallen out of its proper arrangement, and no one had thought to do anything about it.
"I am Elizabeth Bennet. Miss Elizabeth Bennet."
He couldn't help but notice the emphasis she placed on Miss. He struggled against a sinking feeling. His fate was sealed, then. A decision he'd long been loath to pursue had been made for him, by this woman and George Wickham. He looked away from her as a terrible thought came to him. They couldn't have planned it, could they?
"Mr. Darcy."
He turned back to her, taking in anew her swollen face, flecked with cuts. No, even his wealth wasn't worth being pushed down a hill. Not that he'd put it past Wickham to charm a woman into such a scheme without telling her that he planned to shove her. He'd no way to know if she would survive, though. Too uncertain a plan even for Wickham. He must be up to something else. Georgiana. Darcy had to get to Ramsgate. He needed to ensure that whatever Wickham plotted didn't involve his sister.
"May I impose on you to alert my relations to my whereabouts?" she was asking. "The gardeners."
She named the inn Darcy remembered from his childhood adventure in the next town over. "Yes, certainly," he agreed. "They may already know. I sent a man to ask about missing persons, but armed with their name I will send another."
"Thank you, sir. That is very kind. I really cannot thank you enough for your help."
"You saved my life," It is I who should thank you." Her split and puffy lip would allow only half a smile.
"Perhaps we are even then,"
she murmured, settling deeper into the pillow.
"I am sorry, Mr. Darcy, but I am so very tired."
Should he tell her that he must leave as early as possible in the morning? Her eyes already drifted closed. If she could find sleep with the pain she must be in, he should let her have it. He noted the broth on the table. He'd forgotten to offer her any. Not her. Elizabeth. Miss Elizabeth Bennet. He sought through his connections, in the vain hope he might know a Bennet or a Gardiner. He did not, which meant they likely weren't worth knowing, by London standards or even local ones, as he was moderately familiar with Kent. Of course, if they were in an inn, they were travelling and could be from anywhere. An inexpensive inn, as he recalled. Did they stay there because it was the only place to stay in a small town, or because they couldn't afford to come one village over to have better, this aunt and uncle? And why aunt and uncle, not parents? Were they dead then? So much more he should have asked her, but she was already asleep. As she would no longer wake in a strange room alone with no way to know what had happened, Darcy rose as quietly as he could and slipped out, locking the door behind him and pocketing the key. In the hall, lighted by 2 opposing sconces, he pulled out his watch to find they were in the small hours of the morning. Still he could hear the murmur of late-night drinkers below. Perhaps he could find someone reliable enough to hire to go find the Gardiners. Stephen's head appeared, followed by the remainder of him, as he crested the staircase. Surprise, echoed in Darcy, flashed across Stephen's face, before he organized his features and hurried down the hall. Voice low in consideration of the closed doors around them, he said, "Sir, I was coming to tell you, a Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner are below, seeming quite distressed. The man we sent found them." How did they get here? He couldn't imagine anyone taking the Gorge Road in the dark. The North Bridge has been repaired. Traffic resumed about an hour ago. It appeared Darcy's desire to leave as early as possible would be met. The horses are rested?
Yes, sir.
I know it's an imposition, but I have an unsettled feeling about all this. I'm afraid I must ask you to rouse the others. We'll resume our journey to Ramsgate the moment I finish my business with Mr. Gardiner.
Yes, sir. I had them put in the private dining room downstairs, at the back.
Good thinking. If you can, see that food and drink are brought. Anything available will do.
I already asked, sir.
Darcy nodded. Stevens knew he would wish to be welcoming to the Gardiners. He was a good man. Leaving Stevens to go ready the carriage, Darcy went to the indicated room at the back of the inn, finding his valet correct about its suitability. Noise from the common room would reach them, but only as a dull murmur. They would be able to discuss Miss Bennet's fate without being overheard. He went in to find 2 well-dressed individuals, her handsome, if a touch matronly. He looked like a gentleman and had keen, intelligent eyes that reminded Darcy of Elizabeth's. Rather, Elizabeth's one eye, Darcy thought with grim humour. The other was too swollen to use as a comparison. Sandwiches and ale waited on the table, but neither sat, Mrs. Gardiner twisting her gloved hands in a tight, tortuous manner. Darcy halted inside the doorway and offered